Greetings, parish orphans and retrogrades. Happy Friday. Oh, the show we have for you today, the Friday episode of Rules for Retrogrades you're about to behold, is a discussion between yours truly and Mr. Seamus Coughlin, who is the creator of Freedom Toons and co-host of Timcast with Tim Pool, which is an excellent show. And he's about to start his own podcast, and he's just got a bunch of things going on. And I'm sick of talking about him in the third person, so let me introduce you in the second person, Mr. Seamus Coughlin.
Wait, who says I'm not sick of talking about me? Why are you throwing this on me?
Because you're an egomaniac. No.
I know, it's true. I am. Listen, I got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, get ready for your Friday penance, because you're going to be hearing me on the podcast for the next hour, and I am insufferable. So should be a good opportunity to get some time out of purgatory.
It's true. It's true. But you're less insufferable when I can call you by my affectionate nickname for you, which is Shamecog.
That's what they all tell me. They're like, I knew you as Shamecog before I knew about Freedom Toons, because that's what Tim Gordon calls you. And I was like, well, yeah, look, sometimes a nickname just sticks.
Yeah. B Rabbit. Yeah. That's what they call you on the mic when you turn snake on a microphone. They go,
well, they call me S Money. Actually, depends on the neighborhood.
Yeah.
You want to know what they call me on the south side?
What?
Nothing. I don't go to the south side. It's very dangerous.
They would just kill me if I went there.
Yeah. No, I went. Yeah. There. I had a lot of extended family on the south side of Chicago, and it's spent a good amount of time out there. And it's, some of the areas are not so bad. Some of the areas are a little bit tough, but they don't call me anything out there. They ignore me. They don't know about Freedom Toons. It's like I walk down the street. I'm like, I'm not getting recognized here. This is unbelievable.
In your hometown, there's nothing.
I'm a total diva. I'm a total diva. If I go out in public and people don't know who I am, I'm having a bad day. I go, how dare you? Yeah. Don't you know I'm Freedom Toons? I'm Freedom Toons. How dare, do you know who I am? And they always say no. And I'm like, oh, all right. Okay. Well,
yeah, they should recognize. They should recognize your hand stroke. Like if you go to the
exactly, like, because I'm always walking around with my pad of paper sketching on things. And then if people come near me to try to speak with me, I'll like hiss at them or something. And it's like, you think you'd know that I was, a YouTube cartoonist based on that. But no, people unfortunately don't make that assumption when they look at me.
That's weird. People are weird. That's weird that they.
Yeah, no, that's really weird.
Well, a prophet is never recognized in his hometown, and so extended family, the number one thing they do is recognize when you're in your hometown, your cartooning skills. That's something many of us have learned. That is the main mark of extended family. Seamus.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I have not been in the Chicago area for quite a long time. I grew up in the suburbs outside, but I've lived in Georgia for probably past 7 years now, which is crazy how quickly that's flown by. Got to tell you, never going back to Illinois. It's crazy. It's an insane state. Cook County is just awful, legally speaking. I mean, that's where I grew up, and the laws there are just absurd, and it's getting worse. All this catch and release stuff and allowing criminals to run free regardless of how horrible the crime they just committed was. It's terrible. It's terrible, man. And it's how they want all of America to look.
I understand. Being a native of blue state, California, I'm always saying, get out of your blue state, get to a red state, go to realestateforlife.org, by the way.
Oh yeah, I'll check that. But doesn't it kind of break your heart in some ways, because it doesn't make sense to live in some of these areas anymore? But it's like, I can't remember what this is from, but it's like, they're the ones who suck. Why should I leave? Right? Like they're the one. At some point you have to, because it's just irresponsible to stay in these dark blue areas, but it stinks to have to surrender the place where you grew up.
Well, okay. So beginneth the balkanization conversation. We're going to talk about politics, culture, religion, and cartoons, of course, today. Mm-hmm. Should we begin down this path of balkanizing in the red states? Because and many people know, this is a big topic for me. Should I make this defense? Should we get your point of view on it? Because it is a good topic.
I've thought about it a bit. I don't know that I have like a fully fleshed out opinion on the matter. So I probably don't have as much to say on that, but it's definitely an interesting conversation. Just be prepared that there's going to be a lot of, there's probably going to be some uncertainty on my end, because it's something I'm still learning about. I used to very much me in favor of that idea. I just think that the way the United States federal government operates is horrible. I think the way it operates on the world stage is also horrific. There's a question of what happens between the population of the United States and our foreign adversaries once the union breaks apart, right? And if we do balkanize and the US federal government dissolves, what does China do? You know, do they sweep in here and take as many of our resources as possible? Do they just take advantage of us in even more heinous ways through trade policy once they have far more leverage? I don't know.
Yeah. So, okay, start at the beginning really fast, and we won't cover this in great depth, but you did just do a super interesting interview on Michael Malice's YouTube channel.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you did so well.
Oh, you're too kind. I appreciate that. It was a good time chatting with him. I felt a little rusty because it's been a long time since I've done a podcast. I've been off Timcast for 2 months just because I've been traveling. But yeah, Michael was great to talk to.
And he pushed you in ways that were arguably the two dearest issues to my heart. Like, how can you be Catholic when the church is so crazy over the last 9.5 years in specific, or more generally 50 to 60 years? And you gave just knock it out of the park answers. And the other half of it was, why do you no longer call yourself a libertarian? So I want to hit these answers, and I want to highlight where I think you're great. And I want to ask some specifiers. But first, let me just answer your question really fast. The same question that you pitched a second ago, why leave your state and go to another one in full faith and credit just because it's overrun, is a similar tone of voice that I get interrogated under the heading of the question, why are you and Dr. Michael Robillard saying don't go to college at all? Shouldn't we stay and fight? And here's the main answer, Shame Cog, is that's going to stick.
It better not.
It will. Now, the main answer is because people don't stay and fight, right?
Shame Cog, Shimcast, it's just pile them on.
Shamecast,
Papa Toons, whatever it is,
Yeah. Whatever it takes. Well, no, but so people don't stay and fight. We don't have to talk about it much more than that. But what they do is, particularly this sort of cucked suburban conservative thing that took over before the new right started responding to it with edgelord positions. Some are good, some are bad. Yeah. I guess I'm part of that. But it's because people don't fight. Conservatives just stay. All my friends in California, all my family in California, just stay in the semi enclaves that are a little red. And they're like, oh, this is the reddest part of California. And then they vote for a losing assembly person, or they vote for a losing senator, and the culture continues to get further to the left. And they're not acknowledging what a true republic is. This is what I wanted you to say to Michael Malice also. I mean, you said everything it was like an A+ interview, but he was asking you, hey, Shame Cog, why are you no longer a libertarian? And what was amazing is you're like, well, it's not that I've repudiated everything that was true or good about libertarianism, and I was rooting there. You said it's just that outside of economics, where I think you're an economics freedom champion. If I called myself a libertarian, libertarians would write me and say, hey, on these positions, pornography, abortion, there are others, I would get cleaned up. And I always just say, federally, there is no such thing as a police power. So guys like myself, and I think you, basically identify as libertarian. I don't want the federal government doing much at all. But at the state level and the city level, I want abortion. I want abortion outlawed anywhere you can get it.
I think federally, I would push for a federal abortion ban. Absolutely.
That's fine because the 14th Amendment has already broken everything. So forget abortion for now. But banning porn, banning contraception, banning gay marriage, that was done. That was undone at the level of the 14th Amendment. And I'm strongly this is called the police power. It's the heart of the 10th Amendment. I'm a total conservative. Legislate morality there at the local level, which is the Catholic teaching.
Well,
so
it's not possible. I'm sorry to interject here for a second, but whenever people say legislate morality, it's not possible to not legislate morality. All legislation is based on somebody's view of how the world should be. That's morality.
True.
That's it.
True.
Right. So what it's hilarious because the left always says, you can't legislate your morality. we abstract that. No, they're being literal. They're saying you can't legislate your morality. They have no problem with legislating their morality.
Absolutely.
And so we can't either. Like, that's ridiculous. You also made this point, which I would want to touch on, because there's something we were talking about a little bit earlier on how many conservatives are moving towards a bigger government position. And this kind of ties in with what I think we're discussing here. You mentioned this idea of staying and fighting. And it's complicated because on the one hand, like, sometimes you have to think what's best for me or my family. And that probably is living in a red state. You know, where do we have the most, the best prospects of having a decent future? Probably a red state. Then on the other hand, like you said, there is something to be said for staying and fighting. And I think you get this argument from conservatives when it comes to expanding the federal government in ways that you and I would say are probably too far. But they'll basically say, look, the left is going to do this, whether we like it or not. They're always going to abuse federal power. So doesn't it make the most sense for us to try to get a grasp on that power rather than try to abolish it, because they're always going to have it if we run away from it?
But so are you saying, just so I'm clear, I was batting around asking this question to you, like, hey, in politics, a bunch of conservatives on the new right have gone basically big government, inside and outside the Catholic world, especially inside the Catholic world. They're calling themselves post-libs or integralists. And I thought, when I asked the question, maybe I'm hearing differently, I thought you're kind of roughly where I'm at, not in this cadre.
No, well, the thing is, I think I'd lean towards where you are. Like, when it comes, when you look at the federal government, generally speaking, I'm fearful of it. And I also think that part of what having a strong centralized authority does at the federal level is it really does encourage more left-wing modes of thinking. People become much more comfortable deferring responsibility, and they become less able or incentivized to defer gratification. And so I actually think having a gigantic nanny state like that, that's meddling in everyone's affairs, cultivates a leftist perspective. And we know that leftism is not possible unless you have a strong authoritarian regime at the center.
Right.
So I'm wary of big government. That said, one of the arguments I'm sympathetic to is if we're not trying to get to the gun, they are going to get it. And I'm still kind of working through that one.
But how do you work those through? I mean, this may get way more philosophical, and you say you're working through it, but literally the gun, we can't reach the gun first because inherently globalist power corrupts. Now just hear me out. Maybe I can win your heart and your mind forever, Shamecog. It's Honolulu to Washington, D.C. is 5,000 miles. It's right around 5,000 miles. For Washington, D.C. to legislate that a farmer in Honolulu cannot eat his own wheat, which the federal government did in Wickert v. Filburn, cannot eat his own wheat from 5,000 miles away, that's not nationalism, which is what the post-liberals are pitching. That's globalism. And that's the thing. Nationalism, I would say nationalism is to globalism as localism is to nationalism. So what I'm not advocating is that we all just be a bunch of city states and we're independent of each other like Greece or something. What I'm saying is original America had the ticket. It was called Imperium in Imperio. And the federal government has grown too large. A bunch of the post-liberals who are cheering for national government, the ones that want porn, and I want this too, porn, contraception, homosexuality, and gay marriage all banned with an official, like, established religion. Did you know all of those things were made illegal to be banned by the 14th Amendment that the post-liberals cheer for? Because of what you said. Anytime one grasps that gun, one becomes a big centralizing leftist. And that's the first thing they did after the Civil War is they made it illegal for the states to, as they were originally going to do, most of the states illegalized contraception, pornography. I can tell you the case law in each of these: pornography, contraception, homosexuality, gay marriage. And they did the opposite with regard to most of the states had an official sect of Christianity. So interesting. Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
8 of 13 original states had an official established sect of Christianity, which I push for, but you can only do it on the state level, not the national level.
So no, there's a bunch of things to dive into here. Firstly, you made this point about nationalism versus globalism, and there's an interesting discussion there, because how large does a nation state become before we're just talking about some other form of globalism, right? So if there's a country so gigantic that, let's say, 1/7 of the world population lives under it, you're not talking about a kind of small nation that has 20 million people in it. And so you're starting to encroach upon a globalist mentality there, right? Because I think we would agree, if you had one government that controlled half the planet, we would call that globalism, right? Even if the entire planet wasn't controlled by this monolithic authority, we would say this is a giant enough state apparatus that it's controlling literally half of what goes on in the world, and that obviously gives it a tremendous amount of influence in what's going on in the other half of the world. And so you look at the United States federal government and you go, okay, well, this lords over 340 million people. That's gargantuan. So people try to impose a kind of nationalism born out of history onto gigantic nation states, the likes of which our forefathers could never have conceived. I mean, it's massive. You know, the founders did not expect or intend for the large part of the continent of North America to be ruled by one monolithic federal government that had all of the powers that our federal government has. Right. So even the idea of what nationalism means has just changed because of the scale of modern nation states.
Absolutely.
So I hear you on that. And then when you look at things at like the local level, and you sort of mentioned trying to use law to cultivate virtue, or at the very least, even if not cultivate virtue, to stop the spread of horrific vices by doing things like banning pornography. There is something to be said for the fact that conservatism is almost inherently localized, because it's a very leftist mentality to say, I need to know what people thousands of miles away from me are doing, and then I need to make sure they're doing it the way that I want.
Right.
Now, to be clear, so I'm already imagining the counter argument. Well, what about the evangelistic impulse and the fact that Christians are supposed to spread the gospel to all the corners of the earth? That's true. That's valid. But there's a difference between Christians saying we want to save people's souls and we want to go on missions and we want to convert nations, and saying I want to impose legal regulations on people on the other side of the world, even though I know nothing about that which we're regulating, right? I want to comment on what farmers in California can do when I live in New York. We get so deep into the weeds with the kinds of things that we regulate. And then when you have one monolithic federal government, people who will never meet one another, who live thousands of miles away potentially, are making decisions about each other's lives, like in the minutia.
Right.
And there is something about that mode of governance that can really only produce leftist outcomes, or at the very least, I would say it's more likely to produce leftist outcomes. Whereas the conservative is more likely to say, okay, I need to focus on my family, I need to focus on myself, I need to focus on my community. What the left does is it absolves itself from the necessity of doing hard work on the local level, and when people absolve themselves of the necessity from actually caring for those around them by abstracting it and saying, we're just going to get involved in everyone's affairs in every other part of the country, and we're going to, like, quote unquote, fix the world, right?
Right.
And so I would agree with you there too, that even though I am to some extent persuaded by this argument that someone has to go for the gun, by like the very virtue of the fact that that centralized apparatus exists, it's going to cultivate a left-wing way of viewing the world.
Yeah, you said almost inherently. It always almost inherently cultivates a leftist mindset. The Catholic Church, the teaching on subsidiarity, before and after the term came into usage in 1931 with Quadragesimo Anno, Pius XI, the term is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity makes the argument that always inherently collectivism, rule by globalism, rule by really, really far away. It doesn't have, I love your point about what if it's half of a world away? Because that a continent-sized republic, that is a circular square, a res publica.
Yep.
It's somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people in a republic, according to Plato and Aristotle, in the classical republican tradition, out of which
that's right,
affirms these things. They say between 50,000 and 100,000. Imagine your neighborhood and like the realism entailed by going to a neighborhood meeting, the people on your street, and they're voting on something, and you can get a little soapbox and stump and caucus and try to persuade them. I do this all the time with my neighbors in a less official setting. That's republic. What's not a republic is like, oh, okay, like whatever goes on inside the Beltway in DC. That has nothing to do with my life. That is pure globalism. I think this would make a phenomenally efficacious freedom tunes where you're pushing conservatives on like, oh, no, that's globalism. This is nationalism. This is nationalism where we're just talking about what happens in this basically whole Western hemisphere, which is what we run.
Yeah.
I think you could do it in a really South Parky way that would be hilarious, but and really effective to people, because the new right does talk like there's this big distinction between continent-wide nationalism and globalism. I just don't buy it. And
so I would say there is a distinction, but I agree with you that it's not the same as sort of a nationalism versus globalism as we would have perceived it, like 150 years ago when nations were smaller. And I kind of wonder, this idea of a republic being, you said 50 to 100,000 people. And I think there's a lot of truth and there's a lot of value in that. I mean, once you extend out beyond those numbers, it becomes incredibly difficult to govern. I wonder what we end up with. Like when you have a nation as large as the United States with 330 million people, and states have some millions of residents. How small do we end up having to break this up if we want to commit ourselves to 50,000 to 100,000 people per republic?
Yeah, agreed. It does. I mean, that's a suggested amount from the classical Republican theorists. Literally, Aristotle, Plato, even Saint Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. Then you really get the ones like Suarez and the Salamancans. These are all Catholics. Bellarmine, and then you get really specific with Montesquieu, who comes out of that Aristotelian tradition, even though he's a fallen away Catholic. But the point is, it doesn't have to just be 100,000. Imagine if the small northeasterly states were individual republics, how much more, and those were nations, how much more then we could say, yeah, I'm a nationalist, because the nation is local. Because, like you said, the scale of nations increased so much. Nothing has any meaning anymore. Now there has to be an intermediary term: localism, nationalism, globalism. All I'm saying that it sounds like you agree with is nationalism is a lot closer to globalism. You were pushing this point to Michael Malice, who has a lot of stuff to say that I find very interesting and that I agree with. But I just wanted to hear what he would have said to you if you would have been like, no. Okay. So porn and contraception, used to be banned by most states until Stanley versus Georgia with the porn and Griswold versus Connecticut with the contraception. And the Supreme Court, using the 14th Amendment that the new right loves, the post-libs love, they made it illegal for the good red states to illegalize these things. So be like, no, Michael Malice, what I would have said if I were you is, I'm not talking about doing stuff at the federal level, generally speaking. Maybe abortion, because it's so wicked.
Yeah.
Who cares? The system's broken. But for porn, contraception, gay laws, I'm saying, Michael, you're kind of a champion of original America de facto. He's good friends with Tom Woods and those guys who are explicit champions of original America. You have to deal, Mr. Malice, with the fact that the 10th Amendment, every conservative or libertarian's favorite spot in the Constitution, stands for the proposition called the police power, which is that localities should be doing precisely this, illegalizing certain moral evils and pushing certain moral virtues. And so he's just the opposite inflection of the other side that wants to do everything at the Fed. We shouldn't do nothing at the state level. I would have loved if he would have responded to that.
So I'll point out two things. Firstly, Michael made fun of me for saying illegalize, even though it is a word, and you used illegalize here. So I just wanted to flag that if you ever have a conversation with him. Michael, if you see this, I was correct. It's a word. I Googled it. Secondly, I was cracking up because when I finished the show with him, I actually Googled it and I was like, it's right. It's there. But the show was over by that point. I was like, how convenient, Michael. But
Yeah.
I think, so when we're looking at what we're going to prohibit on the federal level versus state level, with my conversation with him, he was just asking me about libertarianism and why I no longer consider myself a libertarian. And I just want to mention one thing.
Yeah.
The reason that's in my bio isn't because I have like some chip on my shoulder and like I have made some kind of career statement out of not being a libertarian. I'm the former libertarian who talks about how bad libertarianism is. No, the reason that's in my bio is because people will often still think I'm a libertarian because they haven't followed me very closely. And then I'll tweet something or say something in public on a podcast about gay marriage or abortion or pornography, and people will go, so much for libertarian. I'm like, yes, right. Correct, because I am not one, and I have not been one for years. So it's not any like particular animosity towards libertarians. I think Malice would probably I think he calls himself an anarchist, so I'm not sure how much of that originalism he would defend. But I will say this, what I was trying to say to him, and I probably could have made this more clear, was just at the philosophical level. Part of the reason I don't consider myself libertarian anymore is because in principle, right, I'm in favor of prohibiting a number of things that I consider to be evil. Pornography was the example that I brought up. I wasn't saying here's a specific law that I would use to ban it. I would do it at the federal level or the state level or the local level, nothing like that. Simply that I don't believe there's such a thing as a right to pornography. I don't view it as an injustice by any means for the state to come in and say, no, actually. And even the Catechism states that civil authorities should prevent the production and distribution of pornographic material, right? So this is not some radical fringe far-right position. The world has slipped away from it, but it's a pretty standard Catholic perspective.
Correct.
And that's all. And it's one that I just ultimately don't see as compatible with libertarianism. And I remember when I was first going on this journey and discovering that my values didn't really line up with libertarianism in the way that I thought they did, just because I didn't really fully understand what my Catholic values were. There was this temptation to say, well, like I still am libertarian, right? I really want a tiny federal government. I want the states to be more empowered than the federal powers are. But it felt like doing that would be dishonest. I couldn't do that. I had to go, no, I'm not libertarian. Ultimately, my underlying view of what human rights are is fundamentally different. Like, I don't believe that the only time the state should intervene or the only time force is justified is when someone being aggressed upon forcefully, right? Because according to the non-aggression principle, which was the foundation for the school of libertarianism I considered myself a part of, according to the non-aggression principle, you can not ask the state to do anything that would be aggressive for you as an individual person to do. So like if you wouldn't pull a gun on somebody to stop them from doing something, you cannot ask the state to do the same. But fundamentally, I just don't agree, right? The king does not wield the sword in vain. I believe governments do have certain powers that individual citizens don't. So that's another reason I'm not libertarian.
Yeah,
I believe it is legitimate for the use of force to some extent to be delegated to the state. And that's not to say that I think your average person should be neutered and incapable of defending themselves using force. Like I absolutely very strongly believe in private firearm ownership and the right of a person to defend themselves, etc. But that's pretty much all I wanted to say. It's a fundamental foundational difference in terms of philosophy, but I still agree with libertarians on quite a lot when it comes to foreign policy or the size and scope of the federal government.
Agreed. Me too. And you said it really, really ably to Malice. It was one of my favorite parts, the specific words you chose to parse that distinction.
Oh, thank you.
Was really, really good. Also, I want to get to what you said about Francis, because it was really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, this is a good discussion. Okay.
It proves how transcendent the issue of being a trad Catholic, particularly a young trad Catholic, is. Now you got places like the Atlantic and New York Times and Slate Magazine and The Week calling, all in the last month, in the month of August, calling Catholicism like the hot new trend. And therefore, it's really interesting that you get anarcho-libertarian Michael Malice, who's not at all Catholic, but has some Catholic friends, asking you about stuff from Vatican II and But I would just say this really quick. I'm right with you on your relationship with libertarian. I want to with libertarians. I want to put that out there. It's like people out there call me a libertarian just because of my strong states' rights view. And that's why I'm like, well, use Michael Malice to distinguish. Like literally, I sincerely believe, I'd love to have him on the show. I sincerely believe he would balk at original America, which robustly points at the 10th Amendment police power right of localities and local governments to legislate morality. And guys like you and I are like, no, it just needs to be happening locally, but that's exactly what should be happening. So there's some overlap between a libertarian and my view on the federal government. It might look identical, but you parse the distinction when you get to local government. It's like, no. Yeah. Legislate morality. The Catholic Church, you have to. Ably said, is very clear about it. But
yeah, I mean, like you also, again, you have to legislate morality. There's literally nothing else you can legislate. There's nothing else you can legislate. It's always somebody's ethics being imposed on to the public. Like that's what law is. And that's why I find it so hilarious when you hear feminists and leftists saying, keep your laws off my body, or how dare you impose your view onto another, or how dare you legislate what someone can do with their body. It's like, dude, find me a law that doesn't legislate what someone can do with their body. Like the United States federal government is not telling me what I can do with my soul.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, insofar as we are a body soul composite, you could argue that they are, right? But like if you start astral projecting, they're not going to ask for your paperwork, right? Like laws apply to your body and what you do with it all the time. So this whole, you can't make laws about what women can do with their bodies. Actually, we can, and we're supposed to.
Precisely. Yeah, it's a paper thin psyop that they've run very effectively as they put their ovaries all over our rosaries. And I remember this one time. Right? Yeah. In law school, we went to SeaWorld because I went to law school in San Diego. And before I graduated, I was like, we should go once. And they cannot go 5 minutes without pontificating about the noble animals and the environment. And I was like, I don't care about either of these things. I don't care about whales or the environment. I'm just being honest. But I told Steph, I was like, if I hear one more save the whales, they're so noble, humans are the plague of the earth, a bit of claptrap, I'm going to turn, I think I did say this too. I'm going to turn around and be like, oh, okay. So we're just pontificating to each other. How about this? Don't have sex with your girlfriend. And the gay is very, very, very frowned upon by heaven. And if you do have sex with your wife, you're not allowed contraception. See, we all have worldviews. And if you start legislating morality to me, just because I paid the $45 to SeaWorld, I can do it right back, right? Maybe I don't want to save the whales or recycle. I'm not into either of those things.
Well, here's the thing. I think insofar as we're capable, saving the whales would be great. But this whole idea that humans are a plague on the earth, it's insane genocidal rhetoric. If I were to select a group of people, right? If I were to take a specific ethnic group and say like this ethnic group is a plague on the world, everyone would rightly see that as genocidal rhetoric. They would say that's a disgusting, horrible thing to say. But for whatever reason, when you extend that out to everyone, people become okay with it. It's like, no, saying that people are horrible and should die doesn't become okay now that you're saying it about everybody, right? That doesn't make it good. That's insane. That's a crazy thing to say. And it's another one of these things that people are comfortable saying in the abstract, but they don't really confront it in a concrete way. So like you are literally saying, my child, my parents, everyone I've ever known or loved, a plague. They should be eliminated. What's wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Stop it right now. You're ridiculous. You sound ridiculous.
I like that. I like that a great deal. It's true. You just like the reverse genetic fallacy. The more generic you go, the more you can get away with saying it or something, according to these.
It's very strange. Yeah, but it's true. You can say like the most insanely horrific genocidal things about mankind as a whole, and no one bats an eye. No one bats an eye. Everyone's okay with it.
Yeah. So to take it the papal direction.
Yes.
Malice also, this isn't like the Malice cleanup interview, but
I know. What is this? Are we doing damage control? I thought I did great.
You did. I gave you an A+.
But I actually do think it's funny because so for those who are curious, we were just texting a little bit before the show, and Timothy just sent me some ideas for us to discuss. And it just happened that like some of the more interesting concepts that we thought would lead to more interesting conversations did touch on some of the things that I talked about with Malice, but it doesn't just apply to my conversation with him. Everything we're talking about applies to like conversations I've basically had with everyone who's asked me about Catholicism, specifically this part about the Pope that we want to get into.
Yeah, right. So he does the normal, UTEP two-step, the 1-2 thing where he's being respectful, but he asks you about Pope Francis's, according to me, like triple digits outrageous remarks. I have a show called 101 Outrages by Pope Francis. And you replied, this was the only reply that you gave in that whole interview that didn't sound a lot like what I would have given. And it's funny because it's, in some sense, it's the Catholic one. So it's supposed to be the most formed, but all your other answers, like, that's perfect. That's like what I would give on a good day. But here you replied very conservatively. You did the more rib covering thing where you're like, well, yeah, Pope Francis probably isn't my favorite Pope, but he's been mischaracterized a lot in the media, which is, if I were being fully honest, which I basically am all the time, I would say that's a very like circa 2015 answer. I honestly, Seamus, I honestly don't think that's the best way with non-Catholics to catch more flies with honey rather than vinegar. I've always thought that showing Francis's profound un-Catholicism, even if he's really the Pope, veritably the Pope, is the best way. Am I wrong, or are you just getting into
It's really tough, to be honest. So I remember a while ago, somebody reached out to me. I said something about the Pope, and they just said, I'm just letting you know, no judgment, but like as a Catholic, I try not to say anything negative about the Pope publicly. And I thought that's probably actually a good principle. And I've also noticed that there's basically only one saint I've heard of who ever really was like publicly critical of the Pope. And if I'm not mistaken, like she was asked. And so you're right that on the one hand, it makes a lot of sense, and it can make sense to say to people, look, the things you're hearing about this Pope, a number of the things he's saying are things that many faithful Catholics take issue with. Because I think there is a problem with someone hearing, oh, the Pope said this, and then they misunderstand papal infallibility and assume that the Pope making a statement means every Catholic is now on board with it. And so I hear what you're saying, and part of the difficulty for me was I've had the conversation so many times where I've explained that papal infallibility doesn't apply to every statement the Pope makes, that it's almost kind of become a throat clearing for me. And I assume everyone knows that at this point, but I shouldn't, because a lot of people don't. I assume, because I've had this conversation a million times, that people listening to me have heard me say it, but I shouldn't assume that, because people could be listening to me for the first time, or they could have not heard me had that conversation. So I don't think I spent enough time clarifying that we don't have to agree with everything the Pope says. But on top of that, I think that I do believe he's mischaracterized on certain things. There are some things he does do that I find interesting and even compelling. So like, again, not my favorite Pope, talks about the devil a lot. I find that fascinating. And I find that
it's characterizing conservatives in the church, calling them.
Do you think so? Well, because he's like, he's referred to I'd have to go back into that. I'd be happy to. Maybe you're right, but I just find it fascinating that this Pope, who is admittedly like a church liberal, much more to the left, and not someone who I really defend, other than to say that he is my Pope, invokes the devil so much, when that's seen as like such a crazy old superstition. And how could wise modern church liberal believe in it? But to kind of, I guess to kind of summarize, there's a lot of negativity surrounding Pope Francis. I completely understand. And I completely understand that he's a stumbling block. He's not only a stumbling block for Protestants who would become Catholic but won't because of this Pope. He's a stumbling block for Catholics. Sure. And I know people who were very much scandalized by Traditionis Custodes, like really badly scandalized. And I won't say much more than that. I won't get into too much more detail on exactly how they were scandalized, but I've seen some very bad fruits is what I'll say. And I guess I'm still working through exactly how to address it, because I want to be a faithful Catholic. I don't want to say anything about the Pope that's out of line, right? Ultimately, I'm like a cartoonist in a shit poster. And so I just feel like it's above my pay grade to be criticizing the Pope. But on the other hand, there is something to be said for clarifying when he says something that Catholics don't have to believe, and letting non-Catholics know this is not exactly someone who you have to be excited about in order to be Catholic or become Catholic.
Yeah, fair enough. I would urge you, if you have the time, watch my video. I did 2 videos, the 101 Outrages of Francis. All of those are uncorrected, quote unquote, gaffes. And they're far worse doctrinally than Traditionalist Custodes, which of course isn't doctrinal at all. It's just super mean, and he hates the traditionalists. But that doesn't even make the cut.
Well,
101 times where he says things like Jesus wasn't God while he was human, right? He said that.
Did he say that?
Yeah, he said that to Eugenio Scalfari. He interviewed with him.
And we know he said this. Like, this has been documented, and it is not.
Yeah, man. Scalfari is what he just died recently, but he was like a 96-year-old old style European reporter, ran a smutty Marxist rag called La Repubblica. They'd try to give it to me free on the subway when I lived in Rome. And I'd say, get that out of my face.
Get this away from me. Yeah, good for you.
And he literally, the old school style that is considered valid of journalism in Europe, European journos can do a full interview, no notes or very loose notes, and then reproduce the interview the way they think they can. And in Francis's 11 interviews with his good friend Eugenio Scalfari, he said the following things: Jesus was not human while he was a man. He said souls don't go to hell, they just cease to exist. He said, oh my gosh, there's almost one outrage.
Jehovah's Witness thing, yeah. But that's the other thing too, right? Like, we're talking about a Marxist here, and he didn't record it. We're talking about, like, he didn't even have notes. So
the Vatican would not deny them. The Vatican would not deny them. What they said is literally the denial by Greg Burke from the worst 4 or 5. Literally 11 interviews. Each one has an outrage. What they said is, well, it was like an unpology. They came out the next day and they said, Eugenio Scalfari was just doing the interview the way he heard it and the way he remembered it. They didn't say anything like, no, of course Jesus is God, and we're coming out the next day. In February of 2016, before Morris Letizia even came out, bro, he said that Zika virus meant that Catholics were allowed to use contraception. And you know what happened the very next day when the Vatican came out and spoke on it? They said, yes, he said it, he meant it, and he meant condoms specifically. So he is number 266. There's never been another one like him. And so it's a dumpster fire. It does zero good to not think.
Yeah. So here's, regardless of, like, because I think there's a much longer discussion on giving credibility to the remarks this journalist made, but with or without that, my point about Pope Francis scandalizing isn't necessarily with Traditionis Custodes, wasn't necessarily about his statements. It was about the consequences of them. So I'll just give you an example. I know people who were very scandalized by the Latin Mass being suppressed, and more so than by any particular papal statement. Because I think traditionalists kind of expect, like, yeah, Pope Francis is going to say some things out there that we're going to take issue with, but we're just going to go about our lives and we're going to keep living our faith on the day-to-day in pretty much the same way. But with the suppression of the Latin Mass, you're actually getting involved in the day-to-day life of Catholics, in the week-to-week life of Catholics, in a very different way. So I think that was, like, very particularly scandalizing and very, very serious.
It shows he means
very unfortunate. Very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I know people, look, there are Catholics. There are Catholics who have been pushed in part by the suppression of the Latin Mass to become SAIDs or to move towards the SSPX. Like, this isn't a joke. This is really serious. It is really serious.
Right. And I think there's an
sad.
evident plan or constellation on Francis's part to push those Catholics into those groups. But that's a whole other conversation.
Well, and regardless, right? I think one answer I can imagine a critic coming up with to what I just said and what we're saying is, well, you know, if there are people who are like either becoming schismatics or leaving the church over this, well, that just goes to show that there was a huge problem with traditionalism in the first place. But to counter that, I believe that you have to be careful with basically every group in the church. And so long as they're not doing something that is like openly sinful and in defiance of church teaching, there is danger involved in coming down too hard on them, right? And pushing them out of the church. And that's not like a unique problem with traditionalists. It's not like, you know, some trads were scandalized. And I'm not saying it was a majority by any means, but some number of trads were scandalized to the point where they were pushed from the church. And that would happen with any group in the church if they were treated that way, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Yeah.
It's a prima facie. I agree so much with that statement that, well, think of what Jesus says about it. Jesus agrees with you. He's like, if you should be a stumbling block to any of these little ones, and then he describes maybe the most profound punishment described in the New Testament. And it's funny that you've called him a stumbling block, because I totally agree. But that's why. It's because anyone in the church can theoretically be pushed out of it. And the bishops have so much responsibility for keeping us here. To the extent that they can influence it, they have so much more responsibility, which is why I'm on the opposite end. I'm definitely not super lenient when it comes to my speech on Francis or on Bishop Barron, who did this recent interview, which reflects the same transcendence of being a trad cath in 2022 that you and I know about. He said, we got major Hollywood superstar Shia LaBeouf, you know, being interviewed on this.
Actual Catholic Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah. Actual cannibal Shia Catholic. People don't know the song necessarily, so they're like, wait,
somebody made like a version of the song for Twitter, and it's actual Catholic Shia LaBeouf. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's like you're in your pew behind you. It's Shia LaBeouf. It's solid. I'm gonna butcher it, but y'all should look it up. It's very funny.
Yeah, send that to me. Well, I mean, so can you just speak for a moment as a Catholic cartoonist? And I know you have to get out of here soon.
Yeah.
On the transcendence of the secular cultural transcendence of being a trad cath in 2022. It's kind of neat.
Yeah, well, I would relate this to my faith generally speaking, more so than being a traditionalist specifically, but so often I am surrounded by people who are very black-pilled. And, you know, I've been a co-host of Tim's show. I've taken a bit of a break from that, but I've done that for months, and I've met a lot of people who are very interesting. But given the state of the world over the past couple months, people are pessimistic. And that there are some people, on the other hand, who are optimistic, but in very different ways from the ways I consider myself to be optimistic or pessimistic. So people will say, you know, I'm pessimistic because everything's going to collapse. And then other people will say, well, no, I'm optimistic. I actually have faith in this country. I think everything is going to be fine. As a Catholic, I say, well, my personal opinion, not necessarily my opinion as a Catholic, my personal opinion is things could be getting really, really bad here. But even if things do get really bad, I'm still very optimistic, right? Because my faith and my hope is in Jesus Christ. And inflation can't take that from me. And food shortages can't take that from me. And whatever it is we have coming down the pike cannot take that from me. And so being Christian, really believing in Christ and being Catholic, it gives you a perspective where you can be black-pilled and white-pilled at the same time. Ultimately, you're white-pilled, but you can kind of be black-pilled about everything in the world. You could firmly believe everything is going to collapse and we're never going to come back from it, but still have hope. One thing that I'll quote my father on here is he'll give talks to people, and he'll ask folks in his demographic, you know, boomers, he'll ask them, is your life easier or harder than your parents' life? Everyone says easier. Every boomer says, my generation has it easier than my parents' generation did. And he says, all right, what about your children? Do they have it harder than you did or easier than you did? They all say harder. They all say things are going to be harder for our children than they were for us. That might seem pessimistic, right? But he doesn't leave them there. He goes, your parents, were they better people than you or worse people than you? Better people than me. They were way better people than we were. They're way more detached, all of these things. Okay, well then maybe it isn't the worst thing in the world that your children are going to see hard times. Maybe they will be better people than you.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that. You can be black-pilled and white-pilled at once. That's not a contradiction in terms. I mean, people are like, oh, isn't it all going to collapse and it's coming apart? And doesn't that mean you're a pessimist? I'm like, no, it's all going to collapse and it's coming apart. And that means I'm an optimist. Because I believe in balkanization, baby. Because I believe
it's not even just that. Like, I mean, there is part of that, right? Like not having the United States federal government feeling a need to export pornography and abortion and race socialism all over the world would probably be a good thing. Would definitely be a good thing.
Yeah.
But there are legitimate hardships domestically that would arise from the United States federal government losing its power on the foreign stage. Definitely. But whatever that is, again, our faith is in Jesus Christ. Our treasure is not in this world.
Yeah. Yeah. I trivialized your point. You were making the moral, spiritual point. And I also agree with that, by the way. So, I mean, do you see, well, yeah, you basically answered. I was going to say, so are you an optimist in that second sense that guys like actual Catholic Shia LaBeouf have become actual Catholics? I mean, should we be excited about this or not? Everyone tries to have like a edgelord novel opinion on this. Like, I don't care, man. I don't even care. And it's like, it's a good thing. It's good for him individual. It's good jointly and severally when an influencer becomes a TLM goer.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's great. Now, we'll point out, remember a couple months ago, maybe a year ago, Britney Spears became Catholic and like now she's calling herself an atheist, right? This is why I think it can be helpful to just not follow celebrities. And I generally don't. But we don't want to look at Shia LaBeouf coming in with cynicism. I really think that we should have high hopes for this. It's just, honestly, it's against charity, right? Let's say he wasn't a celebrity. Let's say at your TLM, a former agnostic began attending and said, you know, I love the TLM, I'm becoming Catholic, and gave you the same story Shia did. How would you feel about that? You wouldn't be like, this poser. That would be an unbelievably cynical and crappy attitude to have towards that. So I would say we shouldn't have that attitude towards Shia. I think he's sincere. I'm happy for him. I'm really happy for him. And if you're concerned that he's going to fall away from the church or this is temporary, firstly, be concerned for yourself. Secondly, pray for him. Just pray for him to stay in the church.
Amen. And to be fair,
I think he can do a tremendous amount of good.
Yeah. To be fair, though, no one was excited about Britney coming into the church because I think when she said, I'm becoming Catholic, she was nude and dancing at that moment.
Well, at that moment?
I think she was like literally nude and dancing.
That's sad.
Maybe I'm.
Yeah, that woman, I mean, she needs prayers. She's in a tough spot.
She does. Britney needs prayers. But no one was that excited because I will say Shia demonstrated, exercised a lot of nous in that conversation with Bishop Barron. So I mean, to hear is to believe at a certain level. You adjudge as you go along. It's like, wow, this is not just phony baloney. He's even put all of the language knowingly into his own lexicon. And he was coming up, like I said, in my show after Barron's show, he was coming up with insights and justifications for being bi-ritual, or at the very least being pro-TLM, better than I've ever heard on any other trad site. It's all like chewed meat. He was coming up with better reasons. That means he's synthesized it some. So
he's thinking about it, right? Well, and I'll add this as well. A lot of people want to take this very cynical approach and say, you know, how could this Hollywood guy convert? It's like, well, honestly, there's a component of that which is extremely believable. Like, you don't think someone could live out in LA in the unbelievably shallow Hollywood culture,
right,
and then see Catholicism and go, oh my gosh, this is so much better,
right?
Like, Of course we should believe that. That makes the most sense. That makes the most sense. Be like, yeah, this is a horribly shallow way of living. Oh, look at that. Catholicism's better. Why should that shock us? Like, we should be happy. And there is something miraculous there because there's God working in the soul. I get that. You know, if you habituate yourself towards a bad lifestyle, it can be difficult to see the light. But I think he's upgraded. He's upgraded. And why shouldn't he? It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, he hit bottom. It also means that person doesn't understand, that skeptic that you're talking about doesn't understand the psychological effects of hitting bottom. Think of Tyson Fury, the heavyweight boxer, after he was world champ, and he was talking about, just, I'm thinking of wrapping my Ferrari around a light pole or flying off the freeway, because you get spiritually empty. So I think a lot of those skeptics that are trying to sound cutting edge just don't understand the psychology much, which goes into the input-output machine producing what you just said. He upgraded. It's not that cool. It has the opposite effect of what these cultural skeptics are trying to portray or trying to exude. They want to sound like, oh, I'm not into it at all. It really makes it seem like they actually think that it would be a downgrade to go from being.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
In worldly status, in terms of what the world values, yes. But on the other hand, I get this feeling, and maybe I'm just projecting because this is the way that I used to think when I was like begrudgingly Catholic in my teens. I think that sometimes people can have a tendency to see the commandments as more restrictive than liberating, when in reality, the truth sets you free. Those things are good for you. I think there are people who are experiencing some spiritual difficulties where they really believe that people who are out there sinning are like having more fun than them.
Agreed.
They almost look at it as, I'm being Catholic and therefore I'm missing out.
You agree.
And it's just not true, man. It's just not true. People who are sleeping around and just chasing wealth and doing drugs are not happy. They're miserable, dude. They're so miserable. You have conversations with these people. If you really talk to these people and get to know them, or have had anyone in your life who's lived like that, they are not happy. They are not happy people. And so it's not like Shia went from living this great life to slipping into Catholicism. It's true, the world gave him many things, but he said himself he was miserable because man, unrestrained, becomes miserable. A man who's not willing to moderate his behavior becomes miserable. And he was able to find happiness by coming into the faith. Good for him. Good for him.
That's a good insight. I'm sincerely happy I brought it up. By way of a parting shot, because we haven't talked.
Yeah, no, that's right. I got to split in a second here.
Yeah. So can I just ask you, you got to split on your way out, the age-old question, or at least some sort of specification on the question: why cannot the left meme, why cannot the left political cartoon worth a hoot? Why not?
So there's a very good reason for this, because the left sees art in virtually every other human venture as a vehicle for forwarding their political message. And so that has to come first and foremost. When I'm making a cartoon, I don't go, how can I get my worldview across? I say, how can I make something funny? And because I'm honest with myself, I usually end up writing something that my worldview comes through in. Not because I'm attempting to do that or force it into the work, but just because I'm writing something that I think is funny. And chances are, when you're a conservative, you find something funny, other conservatives will probably find it funny for similar reasons. Now, ideally, people in general will find it funny. Now, I've definitely had people who are on the left say that they enjoy my work. And I think in part that is because we put the comedy first. But I'll give you an example of how this works. On my end, if I'm working on a cartoon and I don't think it's funny, I try to scrap as much of it as possible, or I do some kind of intervention to try to improve it. It's never enough to say, well, you know, the audience is going to agree with the political message I have potentially, so I can just throw whatever I want at them. Because firstly, that's not true. My audience does not always agree with my political opinions. But secondly, even people who do agree with your political opinions should be given something engaging and entertaining, instead of a cartoon which is just effectively you piling your political dissertation on top of them line by line.
Right. Right.
So we released a cartoon a few days ago. We released a cartoon on Thursday making fun of the Lord of the Rings reboot. And maybe it gets like a little edgier and offensive than I usually do. But when I was working on it, it was Wednesday. It was the day before we were releasing it, right? And this was already a big cartoon that I was worried about finishing in time. And I noticed as I was watching it back Wednesday that I was not laughing. I didn't think it was funny. I sent it around to people. Hey, do you think this is funny? They thought, it can be stronger. And so I ended up scrapping a bunch of lines, cutting it up, adding a bunch of lines in, and really working around the clock with myself and the animator who was assisting me to get the thing done and make sure that it was funny. Now, if you don't view art as something that's supposed to exist as an end to itself, and you believe its only purpose is to forward your political message, then who cares if it's not funny? Who cares if it's not entertaining? It says what I want it to say.
Right.
It uses the proper words to express my position, and nothing else matters. Fundamentally, I think that's why the left can't meme. When you look at their memes, it's going to be ironic to hear me making this criticism given how verbose this answer's been, but it's just walls of text. Extremely wordy.
Yeah. No,
and
yeah.
I try, honestly, with the cartoons, because it's animation, there is an economy of words that's just imposed upon you by the actual economy because animation's expensive.
Yeah.
And so brevity is the soul of wit, they say. It's also your bread and butter if you're a cartoonist. And I honestly think that that's why the left can't meme. They see no value in having their artwork follow any kind of structured order that would make it entertaining. They think it's enough to say an opinion and leave it at that.
Yeah, that's good. I like that a lot. Brevity is the soul of wit, and brevity is also the bread and butter of Toons.
That's right.
I like it.
Clearly not in interviews. I know. I talk with the cartoons, and that's why you'll have to understand. Took me quite a lot to get to the point I am with the cartoons now. I really try to make them short and punchy. And I just think that that's something that a lot of lefty artists don't cultivate. You look at most of what they make, and it's like video essays. Yeah, right. And it's really like long form streams. And I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with those genres, but even when they try to do things that are supposed to be short and punchy, they're really long. Like they're really long.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm thinking of an Office episode when who attempts to make a spoof and people are like misunderstanding it, and it's long and prolix and drawn out, and people are thinking it's a compliment. That's the left with attempted like disses. I mean, I guess one thing that they're pithy at is profaning something holy. They do that really well. Yeah, you're right. I mean, they do that well, and they do it they do it effectively, not well. People are going to be freaking out that I said it's good. Yeah.
Well, the thing that they do is it's getting really, really boring. It's been boring for a long time, but like if you say something about gay marriage being wrong, you're secretly gay, right? And that like that's the joke. If you say something about pornography being bad, you're probably some kind of sex freak. Like their whole thing is their like one joke is this person actually means the opposite of what they're saying.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the only time where they're ever punchy is when they're reusing this same joke over and over and over again. Like Republicans are against abortion until they get their mistress pregnant. It is literally always the same joke every time. Whenever they're punchy, it's because they're making a joke that they heard somebody else make. And it's always, always, always conservatives actually act like liberals. And I'm sorry, but if your best insult to your opposition is that they act like you've got to do better. Yeah.
It's just the spin on the Gandhi thing. All Christians are hypocrites trope. That's all it is. Yeah, I've never noticed it until you said that, but that's a really good answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
This has been great, man. I'm glad I had the chance to do this. I know we ran a little bit over. I got to jump on a phone call with somebody, but this really has been awesome. We can't wait this long before the next time.
Yeah, I want you to come back on, and we'll get an update once your podcast starts. Seamus Coughlin, thank you. This really is enjoyable to talk to you, not just cartoon in pictographs the way we normally do. I can't
much appreciate it, and hopefully after this your audience will recognize me on the street, and I won't have to go, "Do you know who I am? I am Freedom Toons."
There he is. Look at him. Look at that visage. The noble brow. Seamus, God bless you, man. Parish over the retrogrades out there. God bless all of you. We are waiting for a day when we feel that the year 2022 it is now, the year read Anno Domini makes more sense. It doesn't make sense to stick AD after 2022 because things are so clowny and nutty, but we await that day. That day may be the Perusia. God bless you all. Seamus, thanks again. Deus Volt, folks.
Thank you.